Hello, and welcome to another episode of It Depends. I, as always, am your host. My name is Kevin Goldsmith. I am a chief technology officer. I've been an engineer, an engineering manager, lead, VP, director, etc. over the last 30 years in software engineering. And I wrote a book, and that book is called It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022. And in this podcast, for those of you who are new, every episode we serialize a chapter from the audiobook. And I talk a little bit about it, give a little bit more background about it. We also have a newsletter, and the newsletter appears on the weeks that the podcast doesn't. And the newsletter is serializing the text of the book. So you can subscribe to both, and you'll get different chapters each time because the podcast goes in order and the newsletter goes out of order because each of these chapters is a separate article that I wrote. And so you can subscribe to both and not worry about getting the same thing twice every week. So I hope everybody's fall is going well, or if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, your spring is going well. We are approaching the end of the year. For those of you in more senior leadership, or maybe even at the next level, 2025 planning has begun or is already in earnest, depending on where your company's planning calendar is. That's certainly something that I'm spending a lot of my time on these days. There's a bunch of different chapters from the book. And if you look back through the archives of the podcast and the newsletter, you can see different chapters where I also talk a lot about doing your own personal planning calendar and being really deliberate. It's also getting close to review time. We just finished a whole series on doing performance reviews. So some good material there. Of course, you can always get access to the entire book by buying it. And the book is available in hardcover, softcover, audiobook. You can find it all your favorite stores. It's available worldwide. But the easiest place to go is go to itdependsbook.net. And from there, there's links to tons of different stores in different countries. I tried to, every once in a while, I go and look for it to see what new stores it's in and link to those. So you can order it that way online. You can also go to your local bookstore and buy it. You can ask them to order it for you, and they'll do that for you. One thing I want to ask each of you listening to this, one, please, normal stuff, share it, rate it, like it, whatever in your podcast app. But also, I'm putting out a survey because we are now on the second half of the book, where this is episode 21. We've done 21, 22 chapters now. And so there's 38 chapters in the book. So I'm now starting to think about what happens after we complete the book. And I have some ideas around that, but I'm also looking to find out what you all like about the podcast, what you wish I would do more of, what you wish I would do less of. That'll also help me as in the following episodes. The link to the survey will be in the show notes. So in your podcast app, if you show more or get the notes, there'll be a link to the survey there. Please go check it out. It is super fast. It is a very, very fast survey. It is also anonymous, so you can tell me what you really think and not worry that I'll email you about it. You can also always, if you want to reach out to me, you can send me email. And the email is contact@itdependsbook.net. And I will read your email and I will respond to it. Let's get into the chapter for this episode. This chapter is called Management and Systems Thinking. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background before we get into it. When I talk about learning systems thinking, I mentioned Jürgen Apello's Management 3.0 book. I like that book. I recommend it often. It isn't a very popular book. I'm not sure why, because I think it's great. But that's one of the reasons why I recommended it. The book I see more often when you look at manager books or books managers should read is Donatello Meadows' Thinking in Systems. And I have also read that book. That is a great book that introduces a lot of the kind of core concepts of systems and system engineering. Definitely also worth a read if you're interested in understanding systems and systems engineering better. the idea of systems thinking as applies to management was not a new idea. I wrote about it because there was something that had occurred to me that was my own take on it, which is why it's not really an introduction to systems thinking. It's not that at all. It's mostly saying it's important to do systems thinking. You should learn how to do that. But here's an important part of how you apply it. And I mentioned this idea that managers often say, we as managers are planting gardens. And it's a metaphor I really liked and would use a lot for a long time, because there's a couple things about how you plant gardens. Not that I'm a huge gardener, but I watch a lot of gardening on TV, believe it or not. You plan out the garden, you dig the furrows, you plant the seeds, you nurture the seeds, stuff comes up. You can't plan it exactly. You can't say, I'm going to have a rose with this many petals on it, and it's going to appear exactly here, and then this is going to appear exactly here, and it's going to be exactly this height. Plants are organic. They're going to do what they do. You guide it, but then oftentimes whatever was in your head is superseded, is actually improved on by nature, by these living things doing their thing. And I like that metaphor because a lot of management is like that. If you think about management as really pushing down onto a team and like, you do this today and you get it done by today, and here's my Gantt chart and you're going to achieve this by here, and think of it as a real precision kind of role. That's not the case. That's not the case at all. And in fact, if you try and do that, one, your team's going to hate you because you're micromanaging jerk. But also, it never really works out that way because, again, these are people, and people, sometimes they're going to get stuff done faster. Sometimes it's going to take them longer. Sometimes other teams are going to get in the way, or this new thing's going to come up and it's going to kind of mess with that precision. Engineering is not a precision science because it involves humans, right? Not machines, at least for now. And so for that reason, this is where I bring in this idea. This is where I like this idea of gardening and systems thinking, which is understanding the system within which you work, understanding your team, and setting conditions, setting the possibility space for the team so that it's not exactly maybe what you wanted, but it's going to be good. It's going to be generally good. And that means, for example, understanding in systems language your sources, your sinks, understanding your constraints on the system, and building something that works within those constraints, supports the maximum flow from source to sink, which in a software engineering team is from story on the board to shipping to customer, and trying to figure out how to maximize that flow like you would in a normal systems engineering, but also understanding the constraints in which the system is under and trying to figure out how to work around those constraints in order to maximize flow. That's really what we try and do as engineering managers, as engineering leaders. And if you try and do that through this micromanaging system, not going to work too well because you can't control every aspect of everything. But if you try and set it up where people have the right information to do their jobs, they know where the boundaries of their autonomy are, they know where the guardrails are. I can go up to here, past here I need to check, but up to that point, I have complete freedom. That really sets you up for success. And I say this not from thinking it, I say this from living it. And I say this from having done this in multiple teams over multiple years. The best performing teams I've ever been a part of, the best performing teams I've ever led have been teams where people understood, I can make this decision. I have the information I need to make this decision. I don't have to go ask. If something looks weird or something looks not right, I can go and figure it out. I don't have to wait. I don't have to go ask. I'm empowered to do that. I know if it gets past this point, that's where I maybe need to check in. But that allows a lot of good stuff to happen within the team. without a ton of synchronization. And even junior engineers can do this really, really well. The difference is they just have to know where those guidelines are, where those guardrails are. In teams I've been a part of that have done this well, super high performing, super fast turnaround, super high velocity. In the teams where oftentimes someone I've maybe joined a company and the company's had a very different type of culture where it was a real sort of permission-based culture. You have to ask. You don't get to make decisions on your own. You always have to ask. In that kind of culture, they struggle. They really struggle. And it takes a while for them to sort of unlearn to get to this point. And that's really when they get to this point, you can just see people light up. You can see how much more they value their work, how much more they enjoy their work. So I'm a huge proponent of this, but it all comes back to that kind of systems thinking and understanding where your team fits within the larger system and the system that your team exists within, the system that exists within your team. And then you work to shape that system just like a good system engineer would do to optimize and improve. And really what you're doing, again, is just setting the right conditions, planting the right furrows, making sure the garden is watered and there's good nutrients in the soil. So that's why I really talk about this sort of idea and why I really believe in this systems thinking. I'm going to give you the backstory of where this chapter came from. Around, I'm not going to say exactly, there's a date on the chapter, and you can look at my resume and figure out which company maybe I'm talking about. But I'll tell you, it may not exactly line up. So just be aware. But honestly, I've experienced some of these problems in multiple companies where you're doing, let's say you're engineering manager or a director or a VP or whatever, CTO, and you're trying to plant this garden. And you're trying to set these conditions. And as I said, it takes a little while, especially if you're coming from a very different culture. And not all teams work this way. Like I talk about teams that are really kind of metrics driven, like sales, like marketing, where it's not that they're transactional and there is a notion like you have to do sales training and things like that to get numbers up. But you expect the marketing team is driving more leads and the sales team is selling more product. And if somebody in that team does not make the sales, their quota of sales, they often get let go. So they're much more transactional. They're much more kind of short-term driven, even if they have longer-term strategy, than engineering is. And what I've experienced in some senior leadership teams, and I'll say more than one, has been I'm over here trying to build this system for long-term success for the organization. And maybe we're even at the point where we're starting to get some return on it and starting to see some value on it. And I talk about this in this chapter, but also in other chapters, this idea of you can't go dark. Everyone needs to understand what you're doing. In the exec team, everyone needs to approve of what you're doing. If you just go out on your own and you're quiet about it, what it looks like is not much is changing until all of a sudden stuff starts to get good. But I've often encountered this thing where the team is starting to build that momentum and it's starting to work. But some other team is like, what's going on? We're waiting on this and we're waiting on this and we need you to do this now. And they want you to be, as an engineering leader, they want you to micromanage. They want this or they want that. And that's where to be honest, I've struggled. I've had struggles in the past. I think I'm a little bit better at it now, but certainly the first couple times this happened to me, where all of a sudden they're like, well, wait a second, like you need to tell us. I've had exec teams tell me, you need to tell us what every engineer, like we should be able to know what every engineer in your team is doing every day. And I'm like, why the F does the sales team need to know what each of the engineers, there's like 150 engineers on my team. That's ridiculous. But the sales team had decided they were not getting the things that they were demanding of engineering on a fast enough cadence. And they started making noise. And then all of a sudden, I'm now in the exec team having to defend what the engineering team is doing or whichever teams report to me. that is the challenge, right? If you're building this garden, you're doing this work, if you're doing that, it's not always obvious outside. And where I've been most successful has been where I involve the whole company in it. And it's not just a thing the engineering team is doing or just engineering and product together. It's something where the entire company sees it, the entire company understands it, and the entire company understands why. And then they support it. It doesn't mean it's always going to be problem free or friction free, but it definitely means I have been much more successful when I've been able to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, realistically, a lot of times it isn't so much that it's a lack of communication. You end up with somebody on the exec team who just doesn't care or doesn't think about that stuff and just is totally uninterested in it. And they just really want to be transactional. They just really want to focus on the output and not the outcome, right? And when you're in that situation, it's going to depend on the company and the person and just how you manage it. And I can honestly say, been successful sometimes, not been others. Just been a challenge for me. It's a challenge for anybody in this role. But it all comes back, this idea of systems thinking. This seems all very esoteric. What I want to put into your mind to help you understand is if you want to really try and think of, okay, well, what does this mean day to day? Like, what is this? How do I understand this? How do I equate this to something I know? This idea, this gardening thing. Okay, I get sort of this. Okay, I got to understand sources and sinks and flows and maximizing flow. I guess that doesn't make any lot of sense. The most crystal, most concrete version of this way of thinking for me is the Kanban board. So if you've done Kanban or you're familiar with Kanban, that is essentially mapping the system if you do it right, right? You have the columns, which is sort of each stage of development from waiting for refinement to refine to for waiting to get picked up, for being developed, for being tested, whatever, UX, whatever your columns are. That is, going back to Toyota, where it came from, that is a map of the system. And that is showing the flow of work through the system. And if you can start thinking about that in that context, the sources in that on a Kanban board is the backlog, right? And then the syncs are shipped, delivered to customer. And every stage in between is a different node in your system. And by the way, if you actually track each story through a Kanban board, sometimes what you find is stuff moves back a column. We thought this was ready for development. It's actually not. And you can track that. I think one of the things that really brought this home to me is there was a product manager that worked with one of the teams in my organization. And that team had a big Kanban board in the office that they would track their work on, a big physical board, and they used index cards or Post-it to track the stories across the Kanban board. And that product manager, every time it changed state, one direction or the other, would put a note on the back that said, this state moved from here to here, just a little note to just track the story through the board. And if this person wasn't doing this, but I've seen agile coaches do this, and there are plugins to try and do this in like Jira and stuff. One of the things that made really obvious, if you look in aggregate across, let's say, like all the stories and where their transitions were and how many times they looped back and things like this, how long they sat in each one of these columns, you would get a really good understanding of what the syncs were in your system. Like, where is stuff getting caught? Is it getting caught in UX? Is it getting caught in testing? Is stuff sitting for a long time in getting ready for development? And so that is actually advice I've often given to people, either people I mentor or people in my own organization, where let's say they're kind of trying to figure out why is stuff taking longer than it should. Like, we have really easy stories or really simple, straightforward stories, and it seems like it's taking a really long time to get them from backlog to ship. And what I'll tell them is, if they don't already, say like, go start a Kanban board, track each of these stories through the different transitions, and then collect a bunch of them, and then look at how long each story sat in each column. Go and look like how many times things got sent back in that kind of thing, getting sent from, let's say, like ready for development back into design or whatever, refinement. That's what they call muda, or waste. That's wasted time. That's wasted energy because you thought it was ready and it wasn't. So now you just waste a bunch of time. That helps you identify these sinks in your flows. So if you're trying to think of, okay, I get it, what does that mean to me? There's a very practical, easy way for you to start thinking about systems theory. And I'll also say, long before I understood systems thinking, I was starting to glean this in between the different teams in my organization. There's a talk I give called Organization and Architecture, or Architecture and Organization sometimes. And it's ostensibly a talk about Conway's Law. I've given it a bunch of conferences now. But it's really a talk about systems thinking and Conway's identifying sort of a system. So even though I was starting to understand it before I really had the right words or the right kind of grounding, academic grounding in how it meant, I was already starting to see the value of this. But it really was when I started working with teams that had good sort of Kanban hygiene where I really started to understand it. I now present to you Chapter 23 from It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership, 2012 to 2022, Management and Systems Thinking. Management and Systems Thinking. Originally published on September 17th, 2022. Until managers take into account the systemic nature of their organizations, most of their efforts to improve their performance are doomed to failure. Dr. Russell Ackoff. I came across a Twitter thread from Ryan Henricks about management, and I thought it had many good points about systems thinking. I'm quoting the Twitter thread here. A lot of managers, especially those from an engineering background, think that management is about doing stuff, defining rules, policies, and procedures, assigning tasks, creating external incentives, fixing problems. But a manager's outcome is the outcomes of the system they manage. And what they do is create and sustain the context in which that system can achieve those outcomes. This is subtle and doesn't always look like what most people expect managing to look like. The best managers don't look like they're doing much of anything because they put in motion a system steers itself towards its desired outcomes without requiring constant intervention. This is difficult to value in a context where individual performance must be measured. So what we get instead, because most of the people evaluating the performance of managers do not know what a good manager looks like, and certainly not how to measure it, is a system that values bad managers that flail around a lot, but certainly seem to be doing stuff. So what we have is a system that is incapable of seeing good managers with exactly the outcomes you might expect. See Seddon John 2019, Freedom from Command and Control, Rethinking Management for Lean Service, from CRC Press. It caused me to reflect on my approach to systems thinking in the context of technical leadership. One of the things that helped me most as an engineering leader was developing a better understanding of systems thinking. When I, or others, use the analogy of planting a garden when setting teams up for success, this is what we mean. We are creating the system to enable groups and individuals to do their best work, and then allow good behaviors and results to emerge. Of course, creating a system takes longer than pushing things down into the organization. Still, it produces more creativity and autonomy in the organization, making it more resilient to change or challenges. Managers who do not work with this understanding of systems think that management is purely about doing stuff, defining rules, policies, and procedures, assigning tasks, creating external incentives, and fixing problems. This doing stuff approach can produce good results in small teams or for a constrained amount of time. As Ryan Heinrichs also points out, building a system can be incomprehensible for others in the organization who are not directly involved. especially in other more transactional disciplines. This lack of understanding has often been my biggest challenge as a company senior engineering leader. Building a system takes time. If you can get things to a good place where the system is starting to be self-perpetuating, the rest of your organization will see the improvements and become supporters. Suppose the leadership team is impatient and doesn't understand what you are trying to do. In that case, senior leadership will lean into the quick fixes listed above, reorganization or replacing individuals or trying to drive accountability through reductive top-down control mechanisms. If that happens, you are stuck trying to mitigate the damage and build a longer-term plan to return to your original goals, but it is often a losing battle. This is because the primary culture of the organization has reasserted itself and your chance to evolve it has mostly gone. How do you avoid that fate? Communicate. Make your plans clear in the hiring process, your initial days in the organization, and throughout the process. Set realistic timelines for improvement and celebrate the successes along the way. When your peers are impatient, refocus them on the plan and on the long-term gains you are working towards. Point to the achievements thus far and try to keep their eyes on the prize. Will this always work? No. It depends on the company's situation and how much pressure there is on the leadership team. If the company is stressed, it might be better to refocus on shorter-term solutions that don't actively distract from what you are trying to build. My biggest successes in companies were getting the entire organization on board with the system I was working to build. Gaining support for a new systemic way of working is a cultural change, and getting backing is contingent on the company wanting to change. If the company is on a burning platform, a situation where change is required for the company to grow or survive, you will find less resistance. A burning platform also provides the inspiration to persevere if the change is difficult. My biggest failures trying to build systems were when I did not communicate my intentions clearly or did not get buy-in from the rest of the leadership team, or when I was not effective at communicating the improvements along the way. Another challenge can be a change, losing a customer or a tough quarter, that puts pressure on the leadership team. In this case, you need to adapt quickly. Hopefully, the system you are putting in place encourages being nimble. You may need to pause the change to the system to focus on shorter-term tactical solutions. To minimize the disruption in the organization, be transparent about the need for the change and set an expectation on how you'll get reoriented towards your original vision afterward. While there are many good books on systems thinking, the one I consistently recommend for engineering leaders is Management 3.0 by Jürgen Appello. It isn't just about systems thinking, but weaves it into a broader book about management. I hope the commentary before the chapter actually gave it a little bit more depth. I will be the first to admit it is a little bit light, especially rereading it now. But hopefully the context that I gave you before the chapter was helpful and added some value to that chapter. I also want to have you give a look out. This week, I recorded an episode of the Humanizing Work podcast, which is a podcast I've been a fan of for a while. It's hosted by two folks who work with a lot of different companies, one of whom, Peter Green, I worked with at Adobe a long time ago. He was sort of Adobe's really first agile coach or agile trainer. He and I have a lot of history, good history. I've been listening to that podcast for a while now, and they're really good at really zeroing into challenges teams have and addressing them. I hope you have a good week. I will see you next week in the newsletter. I will see you in 2 weeks back here on the podcast. Have a great week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.